So I'm calling on Matthew Thomas from Blank Rome to lead on the next panel, Regulatory and Corporate Governance Impact on OECD EU OFAC in Shipping.
Thanks very much.
Washington, D.C. I'll be your moderator for this session, the Regulatory and Corporate Governance Impact of OECD, EU, and OFAC on shipping. I have a great panel here today. Just quickly introduce everyone. The nominees for best shipping lawyer in a sanctions comedy or tragedy are. So to my right, Meredith Kirby, who's the General Counsel of International Registries Incorporated, which administers the Marshall Islands Registry. Molly McCaffrey, General Counsel of Dry Bulk Operator and Pool Manager with Global Footprint Guardian Navigation. Molly's also an SMA arbitrator and CMA official. Dan Tadros, who is Chief Legal Officer for Shipowners Claims Bureau, Inc., the managers of the American Club. Previously in private practice down in the Gulf, my partners say great things about Dan and his reputation as a shipping lawyer and pollution guy. And Gina Venizio's a partner at Freehill, Hogan and Mahar, a really well-respected shipping litigator and also really well-known for giving really quality guidance on sanction stuff. So what are we talking about here? It's good to go after the environmental panel because on the environmental side, we're talking about really changing regulatory frameworks and landscape. And here we're talking about the same thing. How regulatory frameworks are changing, the industry is changing due to pressures for improvements in transparency, due diligence, and corporate governance. The big headline grabber in a lot of this is international trade sanctions, and that's a huge chunk of what I do these days. But also on the OECD Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information for tax purposes, and the EU's list of non-cooperative jurisdictions. Multinational organizations pushing for increasing transparency and information exchanging cooperation on corporate governance and tax matters, which Meredith can run you through in just a moment. Why is this happening? Governments and multinational organizations really looking at shipping as a lever, as a vector to achieve geopolitical aims, particularly in the sanctions space, but also to cut off resources and financing for terrorist groups and criminal organizations, and to make tax enforcement and tax cooperation more robust and standardized. So shipping we find ourselves in the center of these uncomfortable pressures. And what does that mean for us? It means for this industry upending expectations, expectations regarding rights, what people expect in terms of confidentiality and protection of proprietary information. Risks. What kind of risks do we face in the sanction space, in the geopolitical space? And responsibilities, things like due diligence and KYC and KYCC, knowing your customers, things that are new and different. So to run us, we have a great panel to run us through those issues. I'll turn it over to Meredith to talk about the EU and OECD issues first, and then we'll have a good roundtable discussion about sanctions.
Sure, good morning. What Matt was touching on is correct. So it's another regulatory environment that touches the shipping community. What's different about the OECD and the EU is that unlike the FATF, where they're focused on money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism, the OECD and the EU are really about people getting their money, right? Countries want their money. And so they want to know who's behind companies, and they want to know that people are paying taxes in the appropriate place. So they're starting to go after aggressive tax structuring. And one of the industries, fairly or not fairly, that they see where that is a legitimate focus is in shipping. So for OECD, there's the OECD, of course, everybody knows, right? That was a predecessor organization to post-World War II world for the rebuilding of Europe that has since become an organization of 36 countries, and these are the big countries that were touched on in the panel before last. The OECD that we're talking about, and the OECD that makes all of our lives a headache, or my life a headache, is the Organization for Economic Cooperation, is the OECD Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information for Tax Purposes. That group is a group of 160 countries, and the goal of that group is to provide an equal footing, right, so that the small countries have an equal say against the larger G20 and OECD countries for establishing and implementing the international agreed standards on transparency and agree of information for tax purposes. How really equal that footing is sort of up to question, but that's their tagline. These standards are generally agreed amongst the forum. However, they're also sort of pushed upon the forum, and then they are dealt with through what's called a peer review process, where a team of evaluators from member countries will do a desk-based analysis of the laws and regulations and guidelines of a country to see if in writing the country has a legal framework to be able to implement the standards in that country. And then it comes in country and meets with the different arms of government to determine if the legal framework is actually being used, and then if the legal framework is actually working in practice. And when that process is done, they go back, they write a report. The report goes before a peer review group. And if actually, right now, they're through a sort of heightened process to try to get more reports through because of pressure from the G20. But it goes to that peer review group, and if they can decide amongst that group, it'll go to the whole 160-member delegation to comment if they have a problem. If they don't have a problem, then it passes. The old way, it had to go to the whole 160 delegation to pass. We're actually at the end of what's called the 2016 Terms of Reference cycle. They update their rules about every 5 or 6 years. This is the new generation of rules. The Marshall Islands, we're at the tail end of that, and the Marshall Islands was just had their report adopted in November of 2019. Fortunately, received a partially or largely compliant, which in OECD speak is a passing grade or a whitelist status. A partially or non-compliant is a non-passing grade or a gray or blacklist status. A country does have to be evaluated. You're not whitelisted through a passive process. If they're not evaluated, there just simply isn't a grade. The goal of the OECD, or these rules under the OECD, are to enforce a system where countries can get access to information either by request or automatically on corporate entities and be able to see the ownership structure of that entity down to beneficial ownership and be able to see the accounting records of that entity. So it goes back to what we were talking about, countries wanting to be able to get their pound of flesh. They want to be able to request from a country where that entity is registered and be able to get that information. So the standards are around a country being able to provide that information. The EU blacklist, which I think is everybody sort of commonly calls it, is really the EU list of non-cooperative tax jurisdictions. So it's looking at something slightly different, right? It's not concerned with the corporate structure, and it's not concerned with the accounting records, but what it is concerned with is what country then you're claiming you owe taxes in. So it is trying to get away from aggressive tax planning, where a country might take its losses in one country and its gains in another country based on the tax structure of that country. So what the EU did, starting in 2016, much to the chagrin, really, of the international community and to the OECD, because the OECD sort of saw this as their space already, the EU walked in and just said that they were going to have their own standards that they were going to go by. And originally what they did is they sort of joined together this patchwork of blacklists that individual EU member countries had just been collecting. And some of those blacklists, you couldn't even determine how you got on the blacklist, what the standards were for the blacklist, how you got off the blacklist. There was just a list out there. And even if you talked to the government, nobody would really be able to give you a straight answer. So the EU tried to collect those lists into one pool, and then from that list, they evaluated sort of 92 countries that they felt had ties to the EU to determine whether or not they should be included in their sort of matrix. The screening started in 2016, and the EU selected countries for screening based on their economic ties to the EU, their financial activity, stability, tax good governance. These are their standards. Least developed countries, so those countries that fell below the UN Poverty Index, were initially carved out of the process. But it's important to note that the OECD also initially carved out countries that fell below the UN Poverty Index. However, the OECD sucked those countries back in if they had an international footprint, like a ship registry. The EU, it's believed, will similarly suck countries back into the rating process if they also have an international footprint. So the screening in the EU is based on 3 prongs. One, tax transparency. So it is following on from the OECD evaluation. So they take into account your rating with the OECD. If you're partially compliant or non-compliant, you fail that prong of the 3-prong test. If you're largely compliant or compliant, you move on. The second prong is the fair taxation prong, and that's the one that everyone sort of wants to talk about. That is a prong which requires countries with preferential tax treatment for certain geographically mobile activities to require economic substance for those activities claiming tax residency in that country. The third one is BEPS, which is, for those who don't know, is a base erosion and profit shifting implementation program of the OECD, and that's really broad-reaching. There's 15 sort of tiers to BEPS, and they're all over the map. And that's still evolving. I think everyone's still kind of figuring out BEPS. So the Marshall Islands implemented or said it would implement BEPS where it applied. A lot of it was moot in regard to the Marshall Islands. A lot of it's going to be moot in regard to a lot of small countries. The Marshall Islands already had prong 1, but what everyone's talking about in the Marshall Islands and in regard to all countries is these economic substance requirements that had to come in. And these were mandatory to get off of the EU blacklist. They not only had to be implemented, but they had to be vetted by the EU. So the Marshall Islands passed regulations on 1 January, 20 January, and 29 August to address these, partly because the EU wasn't exactly sure what they wanted, but they knew what they didn't like. So we would put our regulations through. Eventually, we got to a system that they liked, and we got off of the list. The reporting obligations aren't going to come into force until 2021 or 2022, which is important, because people look at 2019 regulations and start to panic. And basically what the regulations set out is that they're relevant entities and relevant activities. So a relevant entity is any entity that's claiming tax jurisdiction in the Marshall Islands. So if you claim tax jurisdiction outside, and it works the same way for almost every country. So I'm just saying the Marshall Islands because it's what I know and it's easy. If you claim tax residency outside of the Marshall Islands, then you fall out of these economic substance regulations automatically. You provide proof that you're being taxed elsewhere, system's done. If you're a relevant entity, then the second prong of the test is whether you're engaged in a relevant activity. And those relevant activities, as laid out by the EU, you couldn't differ in your regulations, are distribution and service center business, financing and leasing business, fund management business, headquarters business, holding company business, intellectual property business, shipping business, banking, and insurance. Banking and insurance are illegal in the Marshall Islands for non-resident domestics. Like I said, they had to be included per EU mandate. But what everybody in this room is interested in, right, is shipping business. So the way the regulations work in practice is if you're non-resident domestic entity claiming tax jurisdiction in the Marshall Islands and were engaged in shipping business, then you would have to satisfy economic substance. Economic substance then means having an office, having the appropriate amount of employees on island, having shareholder meetings. It's kind of a disaster. However, what the OECD has accepted and what the EU has accepted is a way for shipping business to satisfy economic substance without actually having presence in the Marshall Islands. The idea being that a Marshall Island ship is so heavily regulated, and you have an office, right? It's a floating office with employees, but you have an office and it's heavily regulated. So that satisfies economic substance in the Marshall Islands. So it's not as doomsday as everybody thinks, but like with all of these, right, new regulations are passed and they seem doomsday. I think that the important thing to remember, however, is that these regulations are impacting the whole world. The Marshall Islands isn't alone. Shipping registries aren't alone. If a country or someone tells you that their country is immune, unless they're an EU member, I don't think that that's the whole story. No one's going to be immune, and it's definitely not a country with international reach is going to be immune from the EU. If they haven't been sucked into the process yet, they will be sucked into the process. And then when we were passing our regulations, we really, because we had watched a couple other jurisdictions do it how we felt incorrectly, so we tried really hard to talk with our owners, operators, the legal practitioners in New York to try to get through the process as least painfully as we could.
Thanks. That's great, Meredith. Can I just quickly pass it over to Gina, give us sort of a rundown of hot issues and topics in the sanctions? So I know it's a big ask, but it's
a big ask, and thank you, Matt. Let me start off by saying, as Matt said, this is a topic which we could speak on for a much longer period of time than the 7 minutes or so I've been allotted. So I'm going to be a little quick. I'm going to be high level. I just want to leave you with the impression that sanctions are a matter of serious importance in the shipping industry, particularly with this administration. This administration has shown, and it will continue to use economic trade sanctions as a centerpiece of its foreign policy initiatives. The administration has, and I believe will continue to use economic sanctions to target both those who operate within the U.S. and those that operate outside of the U.S. We have been told and we have seen that the administration is now focused on shipping much in the same way that decades ago they focused on the U.S. banking system. The administration is looking to those who operate in shipping, underwriters, owners, all across the industry, to be proactive, to have policies in place, to protect against protect against engaging in sanctionable activity, and to be sort of a policeman in the sanctions world. Now, when we talk about sanctions, I think it's important to understand that there are two general categories of sanctions under U.S. law. They are primary sanctions and secondary sanction provisions. Both of these types of sanctions can be enacted or issued via statutes, regulations, or executive orders from the president, which we have seen plenty of that in the last 12 months. Now, these primary and secondary sanctions target particular types of activities, but their scope and application are different, and it's important to understand the difference. Primary sanctions are those provisions that seek to target activities and persons with a U.S. nexus. Goods that originate from the U.S., activities that occur within the U.S., and transactions involving U.S. persons. Who are U.S. persons? U.S. persons are all U.S. citizens and resident aliens, regardless of where you are, regardless of where you work. If you are a U.S. citizen and you're working for a company in Switzerland, you're subject to U.S. primary sanctions, even if your company is not. U.S. persons include U.S. companies, companies that are organized under U.S. law. It also includes branches of U.S. companies. You see this often with banks. There are U.S. banks that operate in other countries through a branch system as opposed to a subsidiary system. That branch is a U.S. person. In certain trade sanction programs, notably Cuba and Iran, The concept of U.S. persons does extend to foreign-owned subsidiaries of U.S. companies. That is a significant difference from other sanction programs. So we will see, you might have a company that's been operating in Europe for a while, and then they end up getting purchased by a U.S. company, a U.S. hedge fund, private equity, what have you. That company will become subject to U.S. primary sanctions with respect to Cuba and Iran. Now, primary sanctions, for the most part, do prohibit activities by those that are subject to primary sanctions. If you breach those provisions, you can be subject to civil penalties, criminal penalties. Separate from primary sanctions are the concept of secondary sanctions. Secondary sanctions essentially target activities of non-U.S. persons. Now, I hear often, how is it possible that the U.S. can tell me, Mr. Foreign Country ship owner, that I can't do X, Y, Z? This is absurd. I hear that at least once a week. The fact of the matter is, secondary sanctions do not prohibit foreign companies, and again, I'm putting aside foreign-owned subsidiaries of U.S. companies. Secondary sanctions do not prohibit foreign companies from engaging in anything. But secondary sanctions do say, if you engage in X, Y, Z, we, the United States, can impose sanctions on you. We can describe what we consider to be sanctionable conduct. The types of penalties that can be issued with respect to secondary sanctions are things like putting your company on our specially designated nationals list, the SDN list, prohibiting your officers, your employees, from coming to the United States. Essentially, secondary sanctions are a threat to you as a foreign company. You can do business with this particular sanctions country, but if you do, you may not be able to do business with us. You make the choice. And I think that's important to recognize. The U.S. is not telling you not to do something. They're giving you a choice. It may be a Sophie's choice because, as we heard earlier today, the U.S. economy is the largest economy, consumer economy, certainly in the world. And if you get put on our SDN list, you will be shut out from both the U.S. financial system and the U.S. economy because U.S. persons, including U.S. banks and their branches, will be unable to engage in any transaction involving you, subject to certain limited exceptions. Now, with that background, I think it's, again, important for the people in this room to understand. I said earlier that this administration has indicated a defined shift in focus on shipping. So what have we seen in the last 12 months? And I think it's important to take a look at this.
Yeah. Hey, Dina, since we're running a little short on time, let's just have a couple of moments to have Molly and Dan talk about how they're sort of seeing some of this implemented at the club level and from the owner's perspective.
Sounds good. I could go on for hours. Those of you who know me know it's hard to get me to stop talking. But anyway, go ahead.
I'll start with from the owner's perspective. With all of the increased scrutiny that you're hearing about, and Gina has aptly described, that's all trickling down to the owners. And as a result, owners are being asked to modify their own compliance plans or implement compliance plans if you don't have them. There's a three-pronged approach that I understand OFAC in particular has advised shipping clients to partake in. And one is come up with a compliance plan or revise and update your compliance plan. You need to make sure that everyone is educated. And third, you need to audit. You need to make sure that you're auditing your compliance plan and making sure that you're actually following through with what you're saying. So as a result, from a practical standpoint, significant transparency in an industry that's not necessarily known for its transparency is forcing a lot of interesting discussions internally with respect to potential commercial deals. You know, my chartering guys will come into me and be like, Molly, there's this business in Venezuela, and on the bulk, and we're a bulk carrier, so where I see most of my questions of late or in the last year have been with Russia and Venezuela, which haven't been as touched on as much, but Again, the policy from this administration has dictated that there is significant changes, and they are holding us accountable. So, I'm now not letting them even consider a trade unless I've seen everyone in the process. I need to know the agents. I need to know the banking details of the agents. I need to know the charter, the receiver, every named party. And from what I'm learning and discovering is this is relatively new, particularly some of these countries, and the depth of some of these sanctions is that's not enough. You then need to know, well, who's the shareholder of that agency, or who's the shareholder of that charter, or is there a board member who might be on the list? And all of that needs to be contemplated from the owner's perspective when you're putting together your compliance plan and how you are evaluating it. We're short on time. I'm happy to discuss this further and take questions as we go on, but I'm certain that the club has an interesting perspective sanctions as well. So I'm going to turn this over to Dan.
Thank you, Molly. So I'm going to springboard off what both Gina and Molly have said. Sanctions is serious, and the shipping industry, for once, is being targeted. This is a weapon that this administration is using, and it has impacted every part of the shipping sector. So let me give you an example. On the P&I Club side, and it affects all 13 of the international group clubs. The U.S. government is meeting with us on a regular basis. They're putting pressure on the clubs to put together programs such as AIS programs to follow vessels, and if they go into designated areas, to alert us. So that puts tremendous pressure, not just on the clubs, but our members also. Molly talked about compliance programs. So the two words are due diligence. That's what the Department of Treasury and the Department of State and DOJ are telling us our members and we have to exhibit. Due diligence. What does that mean? There's no definition. The government won't tell us what that is. In fact, I was very pleased to hear Captain Thomas say, and unfortunately he's not here, that a good faith effort to comply is good for the Coast Guard. Well, I hope that's good for the rest of our administration, because we as clubs, and I see a lot of my colleagues here from other clubs in the audience, we are doing everything possible to warn our members, to put together compliance programs, to start looking into the background, as Molly described, of people that they're going to be doing business with. Some of you may think, well, how can we go that deep to find out if there is a shareholder or some owner that has some connection to a country that might be suspect? We can't. All we can do is give it our best effort. And so there is a meeting today in Washington, D.C., which is targeted toward the flags.
Tomorrow.
Is it tomorrow? I thought it was today.
No,
Okay, where they're putting pressure even on the flags to have similar AIS tracking programs. And the government is very serious about this, and I don't see it going away. So if there are operators out there or others who are listening, please pay attention to your compliance programs, because it affects everything you do, especially if you transact in dollars. So that's my 2 cents.
One thing I might note, just from my own observation on the owner standpoint, as this has come to light more recently in the last year, the government has been open and honest and out there in terms of publicizing what they're looking for. When I was first asked to join this panel, there was, I happened to be flipping through TradeWinds, and they published the OFAC's 10 Commandments on how to avoid violating sanctions. They published a paper, if I recall, back in May that was extensive in terms of what they're looking for. They host an annual seminar. I happened to attend this year with thousands of people from not just shipping, from every industry you can imagine, where they outline and talk about and make themselves available to discuss this. So it's prudent for every owner and operator in this industry to pay attention and get involved and understand what the risk is.
Yeah, I think to echo that, I mean, what I would tell our clients is what the U.S. authorities are looking for. They're looking for owners and operators and underwriters, everyone involved in the shipping industry, to make sanctions compliance top of mind. Top of mind. Think about it, assess your risk, have policies in place, training, and keep aware of what's happening in the sanctions world and make a concerted effort to comply. As Dan says, the buzzword is due diligence. What does that mean? It doesn't mean many years ago, might have been you get a single piece of paper that tells you that a cargo of petroleum originates from, Pakistan. Okay, sounds good. Then that's not good enough anymore. You need to do further analysis. They really want you to be proactive.
Yeah, what Dan was talking about is I've been to about 5 of these meetings around the world hosted by state. What they're trying to do really is crack down on the whole chain. So they want everybody involved in shipping to have some skin in the game. What I was told by a person at the State Department is they feel like we all kick the can and sort of do this. And so they want everyone along the line to be accountable: flag, class, operators, banks, insurance, everyone. We've been vetting down to beneficial ownership for over 10 years, but we've been geo-tracking now, or geo-blocking for about the last 4 years, 5 years, where if a country is in the waters of something prohibited or is in an area, say where lightering fuel in North Korea is a risk, that we automatically target, we get alert, we'll cut off services, we communicate with the vessel. Do you know where you are? Do you know what the problem is? Do you know that you're not allowed to be there? And just making people aware that they're being watched. But the risk of secondary sanctions and this administration's willingness to do that and willingness to do it at such a hair trigger point is definitely a game changer. It's changed how we've operated in heightening even the standard practices that we had in place for 10 years.
And what happens in the maritime industry, as you all know, the primary currency is the U.S. dollar. That's the weapon that the government is focusing on, even for the secondary sanctions.
And down in Washington, we're seeing an escalation of activity by the Justice Department, National Security Division, to target companies for using U.S. dollars in the U.S. banking system for dealings in the sanctions space with sanctions targets. I've spent the last year representing owners that have been caught in the crosshairs of sanctions: Costco, PB Tankers, other Greek owners, and really a lot of the center of gravity for this push to target shipping has moved from Treasury to the State Department, and Secretary Pompeo himself keenly interested in shipping. All parts of the industry, not just owners, but financing, insurance, everything. And what they will tell you, unfortunately, Taylor Ruggles, who heads the State Department's Office of Sanctions Policy and Implementation, was supposed to speak to us this afternoon. He had a family illness, and I'm sorry he's not here to talk to you. But if he was, he'd explain their push really is to change the culture of shipping when it comes to due diligence and accountability, like you've heard from all the panelists. And that's a big shift, and that's a big ask. But this is how the administration is coming at this. So, thanks.
Thank you.
Should we have questions, or do you want to go to break? I see we're at 0.0. All right, well, thank you all very much.
There's a question. Dear God.
All right, thank you so much for a very interesting panel.
She had a question, I thought.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I just had one question. Everybody's talking about stakeholders and the whole banks, P&I, flag, class. Gina mentioned a cargo coming from Pakistan going somewhere else. Did you want to elaborate on cargo generally?
Well, yeah, that was just, I mean, Pakistan probably is not even really trading a lot in petroleum, but I just sort of thought, I mean, certainly when it comes to Iran, particularly in Syria, the origin of the cargo is of utmost importance. And we saw, as they mentioned, I mean, OFAC issued advisories to the maritime community last year, and they highlighted the risks involved with certain types of transactions, most notably STS, because they view STS transactions, although commonplace, they view those as suspect and as a way to hide the origin of the cargo. Because when it comes to Iran, for instance, those secondary sanctions are express. We don't want anybody transporting Iranian petroleum. So, you need to take steps to verify the origin of the cargo. I mean, if you're loading off of, an STS point off of the Gulf of in the Gulf of Mexico, probably not highly suspicious. But if you're doing that in the Middle East, you have to do a little bit more digging.
That's a really good question and a really good answer. And I've had pointed conversations with the State Department this year about this issue. If they are going to put massive pressure on the shipping industry to do this due diligence, to collect information about cargo and cargo origin and stakeholders, they need to also work with the global commodities trading industry, global petroleum industries, to work with us and accept and agree to provide this sort of information. Otherwise, they're leaving shipping in an absolutely untenable position. So, Dan, did you?
Yeah, I was going to just add that recently a lot of owners are asking for certificates of origin for the cargo. Well, a lot of those are now turning up to be fraudulent. So now you have to take even one more step past that certificate of origin and find out, did the vessel really load in the port of XYZ? And there's ways to check that. So every day there's something new. There's a new development of how people are trying to circumvent these issues. And so due diligence becomes even more strenuous.
All right, that's it.
All right.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.